Janice, you've taken the title Wiring Warrior. Why is that? And why do you care so much about building better brains?
Yes, it's a funny name, isn't it? And a lot of people have asked me whether I'm an electrician, come onto my website thinking I'm an electrician or think it's a bit funny. Wiring, in this case, is wiring in the brain. And those connections between brain cells, the synapses, are what wire our information together. And I learned about this pretty early on in my time of improving my brain. So I thought, what better thing to do? And today I'm going to talk about the actual aha that led me to calling myself the Wiring Warrior. The reason I feel very passionately about encouraging people to become wiring warriors is tied in with my concern about the aging population. And at about the time that I was starting to work on wiring warriors, I learned quite a lot about how your brain improves when you get older. We hear a lot about how it gets worse, but actually it improves in a number of ways as we get older that enable us to develop wisdom. And so to me, that was huge hope. And it didn't say we're all going to hell in a handbasket, we're all going downhill. It said there is something we can do to use our brains better as we get older. So that's what it's really about for me, Liz.
Well, that sounds pretty hopeful for all of us, really, doesn't it? So that's really great. So I look forward to hearing what you have to say. I'm going to just move into the background now and let you give your presentation. So, yeah, very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So I'll catch you on the other side. Thanks, Janice.
That sounds a bit dire.
Yeah, not that other side. All right, see you soon.
Okay. Okay, so why build a better brain? There are a number of reasons I believe that it's a good idea to build a better brain as we get older. And the first one, obviously, was one that applied to me. So in 2007, I had brain damage and had to start to improve my brain. So protecting against brain damage in the first place, I think, is really important, because the way in which you look after your brain, the way in which you build it, gives you what neuroscientists call cognitive reserve. And that is a lot of potential there, so that if you do lose some of your brain, that remaining brain is capable of reconnecting and being as good as it was before, within reason. The second thing is it gives you the ability then to recover after damage. So a lot of the work I do is people who've had strokes, traumatic brain injuries, tumors, and once you've had significant brain damage, the medical profession very often will help you to walk again, talk again, do all those basic things. But my experience was certainly that you didn't get a lot of help in understanding that you could work yourself to recover a lot of those basic brain functions that you had before. So recovering from brain damage is very important, I think, for most people. The third thing is to protect against dementia. Now, in my first talk, I did mention the rising levels of dementia with aging, and that's a huge problem at the moment across the world. And building a good brain will prevent against developing dementia. The fourth thing here is built on the back of that. So if you've got a healthy brain, then you can develop wisdom. Now, a lot of the research about how your brain gets better was done way back. And in 2011, for instance, I published this little book, which is Wiring Warrior's Guide to a Better Brain, to Brain Basics. And I published two of the things in that the experts were saying, which I found really fascinating. One was by George Bartzokis, who's a neurologist, and he said, in midlife, you're beginning to maximize the ability to use the entirety of the information in your brain on an everyday, ongoing, second-to-second basis. Biologically, that's what wisdom is. In other words, your brain actually can develop into something fantastic with time. And another guy who I also quote in there, Jeffrey Kluger, said, essentially, the brain spends decades upgrading itself from a dial-up internet to a high-speed version, not fully completing the job until age 45 or so. And I love that. I love that because that says that potential to be wise as you get older is there. Of course, you've got to realize it. You've got to do something to make sure that you become that fast internet that you have the potential to be. So the next thing about being a role model is really important, because obviously information, research, knowledge doesn't make that change. Otherwise, we'd all know that. But that was before 2011. Here we are 10 years later, a decade later. And when I talk to people about that, people go, no. You know, your brain gets worse as you get older. You lose brain cells, you lose connections, you get slower. You do get slower, but you still connect up and do things that you can't do when you're younger. So I want people to become role models for that and to be out there saying, we believe people we know. We believe people we can see. We believe the person that's 85 and is still writing books or is traveling around, the David Attenboroughs, people who are still cognizant and wise. So the other side of being a role model is to help others to build their brain. And it's possible for all of us to help other people in small ways to just get better as we get older. So I'm hoping I can give you some information that will just give you a few tips about doing it for yourself, but also helping other people in your family or community. So this is where I started, and this is my story, if you like. In 2007, this was an actual MRI scan of my brain where I had the brain tumour. You can see from the white patch there, the white patch is my tumour. It was quite a big thing. It was sort of this size. It was the size of a lemon, I think they see it. And it was right here on my frontal lobe. So when it was taken out, it left a big hole, for want of a more, not the technical term for it, but it did leave a big hole. And you can see there on that MRI that I had after my operation, after they had taken out the tumour, that my frontal lobe had a big hole in it. It still does, because in the early days, naively, I thought maybe I can build my brain so that that hole fills in. No, it won't. You may grow a few extra brain cells around the outside, but basically I've got that hole for life. But what I needed to do was teach my brain to wire around it and to get back to normal functionality. You don't get back to normal physiology, you get back to normal functionality. So around 2010, I was having these scans on an annual basis because I've still got a bit of tumour in there, so they're keeping an eye on it. So I saw my neuroscientist, my neurosurgeon, and I said, how am I going? And he said, you're a neurospecialist nightmare. According to the books, with damage like that, you should be running down the street naked and screaming incoherently, which I loved. He was a bit of a dag, my neurosurgeon. And the reason I probably wasn't was that from 2007, I made a decision that I was going to really work at building my brain back to normal functionality. In 2010, it wasn't normal, but I wasn't abnormal. I wasn't crazy. By 2011, I'd done even more work, and I asked him, how is it that I am not naked and screaming incoherently down the street, do you think? And he said, well, your brain must have rewired itself around the damage. He was partially right. I mean, he's one of the top experts in the country, but I had rewired my brain around the hole. It didn't happen automatically, and that's what I think I want everybody to understand. None of this stuff just happens. You have to make a decision to do something, to take responsibility for building your brain and having a better brain. So one of the reasons that a lot of people don't do it is we've got a huge number of old myths out there that we all still believe. The first one of those is that our brain is limited. You know, as you get older, it goes downhill. That it never can be any better. And I realized that early on in my life when I was at the wedding of my cousin. And they were having the reception in the church hall and all dancing. And you know, I was sat in the corner reading a book because I sort of don't go for dancing in church halls. And my grandmother turned to my mother. I distinctly heard this, turned to my mother and said, "Here you are, Edna. I've watched Jan there. If she carries on reading them books like that, she'll have no brain left by the time she gets married." So, I mean, that was pretty scary. And I heard that and thought, oh, I'll use my brain up. How much brain have I got to use up? And of course, the next point is the one that was based on, which is brain cells die, and they do. I mean, you lose millions a day. And of course, very early on, I knew how many million brain cells die every day. And the idea was that they can't grow back. Well, that just isn't true. The third thing is that our brains are pre-programmed. In other words, what you're born with is what you have for the rest of your life. So I often hear people say, "No, that's me. Sorry, that's me." No, it isn't. It's you if you choose it to be. It's not you if you program your own brain. You don't come pre-programmed. You come with an operating system, and then within that operating system, you choose how to program the brain. There's some basic preferences there, but you can actually have a huge impact on what happens to it. The other myth is the brain's designed to age, and you will all have heard about that. It's sort of, oh, well, by the time you get to 60, it's all downhill. I hear people talking about going into retirement villages because it's that nice next phase of the life that enables us to be safe and happy, and we don't have to worry about anything because we're not going to be capable of looking after ourselves. Very sad, because actually, if you take it easy, your brain will get worse and won't develop. So your brains are designed to age physically, but not functionally. So functionally, your brains can be a lot better as you get older, as you've heard already. So make the best of that. Don't accept that your brain's just going to get worse. The next to last thing, the penultimate thing, is that damage is permanent. And a lot of people think that once they've had a stroke, once they've had traumatic brain injury, that they can't do anything about it. And if they can learn to walk, talk, and be normal, pretty much normal, that's the best you can get. She's sad because without hope, the situation is hopeless. And I hear medical specialists saying, "Oh, we don't want to give people false hope." But in the process of that, they're giving people false feelings of lack of hope. False despair, I call it. They're handing out false despair. And it just isn't true. And neither is it true that dementia is inevitable. Dementia is not inevitable. Some people have a genetic predisposition to certain forms of dementia. Very small percentage of the population, very small. And for the rest of us, it's largely lifestyle developed, and there are a lot of things we can do about that. So to counter all those myths, the thing that I learned, first of all, I learned pretty early on that physiology and functionality, the way our brain functions versus what its physical capability, they're very different things. You can become highly functional with a brain that's not quite as physically adept. And the reason is because we know about these three things that I'm going to talk about here. Neuroplasticity, that's been around for decades. We have known about that for decades, the brain that changes. I first learned about that through a guy called Norman Doidge, who wrote a book called The Brain That Changes. If you haven't read it, it's a great book, full of stories about people who decided to improve their brains and did, despite being told to the contrary. So we now know that the brain changes. It's self-wiring. You effectively create your own brain. Use it or lose it. And also, the more you do, think, or say something, the more you become it. Hey, great news. You are not just predestined to become more of yourself as you get older. You can become more of what you want to be as you get older. The next thing that I think is really critical is neurogenesis. It's not as nearly as important as neuroplasticity to me. Neurogenesis just says you can create brain cells until you die. Nobody believed that before. They thought you stopped producing brain cells when you were young. Not true. You don't produce as many as you lose, but as you can see, one of the things about wisdom is that you do lose all these redundant brain cells. You haven't got a whole lot of stuff in there so that you can more easily connect. So important, but it's not critical. The final thing has really only come to the surface in the last few years, and that is autophagy or autophagy, if you want to pronounce it like that. And horrible word. What it effectively is about is our cells cleaning out. So autophagy is the body's way of eating up, if you like, or hoovering up old rubbish from cells that are dying and clearing them out. Now, that happens in your brain as well as in your body. It's more critical in your brain. And if you don't clear out the rubbish, imagine what your brain's like by the time you get to 70 if it's never been cleaned out. If all that rubbish of dead cells is lying around everywhere, it's going to stop those connections from being fully effective. And so you will get a brain that's deteriorating. You may even get a brain that's getting dementia. Not necessary, but it is a natural consequence of the buildup of that old rubbish. Now, the interesting thing about this is that one of the only ways autophagy does that cleaning is in deep sleep. And deep sleep is the most fantastic thing for actually improving your brain as well as your body. And that's why I wrote a book on sleep and how to get sleep a couple of years ago, just at the beginning of the COVID lockdowns. And because I was so blown away by how important sleep is and how little emphasis people are putting on sleep. And there are really easy things to do to get better sleep. Problem is, most older people get worse sleep for a whole raft of reasons I won't go into here, but it is even more important when you're older, particularly when you're over 60, to get good sleep. Just to remind you about the impact of dementia on society, because we're talking here about two things with aging. One is to try and prevent our brains from being as bad as they can be, which is getting dementia and being dependent. And the other thing is developing wisdom, which I will talk about in the next part, which is what to do to keep your brain not only functional, but wise and contributing. But if you look at the impact of dementia on society, which I think is terrifying, the older everybody gets, the more dementia we're having, because we're not doing anything about improving our brains. So the larger the aging cohort, it's getting very serious with the baby boomers. People are living longer, and the implications of that are serious. Dementia levels going up, dependency level ratios changing, which means, I think I said in the previous video, at the moment the dementia rates are 50-50. That is 50% of the people are working to support the other 50%. That non-working 50%, young children, people who are unable to work, and of course us oldies. And in the future, within the next 20 years or so, that looks as if it's going to go to 70-30, and not the right way. Imagine if you were a young person looking at those ratios and seeing that 30% of the population was going to be supporting 70% of us. It isn't going to work. Our economy cannot deal with that. Neither can the economy deal with the health costs for chronic illness. And those four main aging illnesses, which include Alzheimer's, are costing a huge amount of money at the moment, and billions a year. And in future, it's going to be costing even more billions if we're not careful. So the standard aging illnesses, heart, diabetes, dementia, cancer, they're all considered aging diseases. No, they're lifestyle diseases. I mean, there are, again, genetic factors that can predispose a small proportion of us. But if we're going to save our health costs, we have, even if we can stop 10% of people going down that route, that's saving billions of dollars. So let's try and do it. The other thing is families providing care. I know I've got a 94-year-old mother, and I'm virtually a full-time caregiver for her. And most of my friends that I know of my age are caring for people because there aren't enough carers in the community. People who are wealthy enough will go into retirement villages, go into care, paid care, but that's hugely expensive. The number of people who can afford to do that in old age is very small, but everybody's going to be paying for the personal, social, and economic costs of this aging population if we can't get better. And to me, it's a responsibility for us who are older to really take that disadvantage away from the younger generation. So basically, I really hope people will become wiring warriors, but most of all to become a role model for other people, to do more of it, to help build better brains for a wiser future, because we have to do that in order to protect the younger generation from what's coming in the next 20 or 30 years, but also to be happy, useful, and not just drift downhill as we get older.
Janice, that's a really great message. I really love the idea of a little vacuum cleaner whizzing around inside my brain while I sleep. That sounds pretty cool. But yes, look, I totally agree with what you say. You know, we can do something about our health and our brains, and we owe it to our children, our grandchildren, and society to try and maintain good health, you know, physically and mentally, because who wants to be a burden in their latter years? So I think, you know, being a wiring warrior, I think that's a really cool thing to be doing, to be spreading that message that we should all be, you know, fighting for ourselves, fighting for our communities against these diseases that can take away the pleasure of life and cause us to be a burden on society, which we don't want to do. So thank you very much for your presentation. We are going to continue this conversation in another video where we talk about biogerontology and some of the advances that are being made in that field. So look forward to hearing what you have to say about that. Thanks very much, Jan.
Thanks.